I'm here with Dack Rouleau of overwritten.org, and we're going to talk about the cult of coronavirus. Now, for those of you who've been under lockdown for the past 6 weeks, as most of us have, but to varying degrees, we've been out in public, been out on the internet, been out in various facsimiles of the real world, and I've noticed, at least, and I've written about this a little bit, but that people's reaction or interfacing with this specter of this scary virus that's going to kill us all, which is as the media has presented it. And I want to put out a disclaimer first so that people don't jump down my throat. There is a virus.
This virus is deadly, but don't be afraid of it. It can only kill people who are vulnerable and also those who are not vulnerable.
It's not the be-all, end-all of pathogens, and it's not going to strike you down in your footsteps if you peek your head outside at hours not immediately permitted by your government of choice. So, getting that out of the way. Basically, I see the coronavirus it's put people into a state of uncertainty, which they're not really used to deal with, especially people in the Western world and people in wealthier countries. They're used to having their needs taken care of to some sense. They're used to having enough money in their bank accounts to deal with their basic everything. But now that some 30 million Americans have been put out of work, and many more have had other aspects of their lives cut off. Maybe they can't see their family, or they can't see their significant other, or whatever. And they're basically in uncharted territory, and the government has blamed all of this on the virus, and the media has amplified the attempt to blame all of this on the virus. But this has given it a kind of religious cast, in which it's basically playing the role of Satan, and a lot of other people are competing to play the role of the government, whoops, I gave away what I was trying to say. A lot of other people are competing to play the role of God, or the priest class, or whatever deity of choice. So, I don't know, I live in New York, which is, of course, the epicenter of scary, scary virus, killing everybody. We're all going to die now. And you, Dack, of course, live in New Hampshire, which you're under some form of lockdown, correct? Are you under a shelter-in-place order?
Not officially. Our Republican governor has ordered the closure of schools in the state for the remainder of the school year, but there is no official order to remain at home under penalty of law. We still have some freedom of mobility, but as you said, the coronavirus has taken on a kind of cultish strength in the imaginations of so many people here. And I think it's serving as a kind of boogeyman that gives us meaning, in a sense, a villain that we can kind of rise up against and conquer. I think what it does specifically is it provides a kind of pacifier to the infantile left, because Freud wrote in his book Civilization and Its Discontents, which ought to be required reading for anybody living out the slow decadence and erosion of the American empire. He wrote about religion providing a sense of paternalistic protection to the infantile masses. Well, the left definitely needs a sense of paternalistic protection from government, and it has not received that for the last several years. The left has taken a really serious drubbing, not just with the election of Donald Trump and the rise to power of William Barr, but also with the appalling so-called Democratic Party primaries of this year. I mean, I don't want to hear Mike Pompeo talk about free and fair elections in Venezuela after what we witnessed on Super Tuesday. So the coronavirus has provided a shot in the arm for the left, because it has given the left a reason to demand that the government take away more and more of their freedoms. The left wants to get in on this, and we see them demanding more repression from the government. They want the Trump administration to take away their freedom of mobility, their freedom of expression, their freedom to assemble, and their right to bear arms as well. And in this, we see that the left is enjoying the submission. The left has been taught over so many years, the right has too, but in a different sense, to embrace this masochistic repression of basic rights, not civil liberties, but basic rights. And we're seeing that come to the forefront, reaching its gruesome climax with the demand for even more lockdown measures in the time of the coronavirus.
Yeah, this is what I find really disturbing, because I've seen a lot of like left-wing anti-imperialist commentators, many of whom I actually respected, at least a little bit. Many I mean, Jimmy Dore would be the primary example of the biggest disappointment, I think, just because while he's not a political scholar, his instincts are generally correct as far as these things go. And I feel like he knows what is good for the working people and what is good for just humanity in general, as opposed to the 1%. But he has completely lost his mind, and he's not the only one. I'm just using him as an example. So if you're Jimmy Dore, I'm sorry for unfairly singling you out, but I feel like most people know who you are, and etc. But it's just sorry.
Sorry, what has Jimmy Dore been saying? I haven't followed that.
Jimmy Dore
is he supporting?
He's attacking mayors who are trying to get their cities back to work. He's on one level, he's calling for workers to go on strike and demand better protection from scary virus from their employers, which I can get behind. I mean, Amazon workers have been striking because apparently they're being asked to work basically on top of each other in warehouses where people have the virus, and I don't know, I wouldn't necessarily want to be doing that, especially if you don't have gloves or hand sanitizer or any of that. But he recently played a video from the Las Vegas mayor, who was talking about how she wanted to open up the city again, and it was an interview with Anderson Cooper, who, of course, everybody knows who Anderson Cooper is, CIA Anderson Cooper, Vanderbilt Anderson Cooper, who he basically played this whole video straight and barely jumped in at all like he usually does. Just to sort of mock this woman, and this didn't say much at all. Just let Anderson Cooper do his usual supercilious sort of like looking down his nose at this. This woman clearly wants everybody in Las Vegas to die because she wants to let them go back to work. And it's just because she wants rich people to go in and be able to gamble in the casinos. Well, obviously, if they open up Las Vegas, rich people will go back and gamble in the casinos, but that means those casino workers will be able to, feed their families and things like that. And I just find it really disgusting how, I would think maybe all these commentators who have suddenly shown their true colors and decided to immediately drop to their knees and start licking boots as soon as the rubber meets the road, maybe this is what they were like all along, but I feel like this, unlike previous events that happened halfway around the world and maybe didn't affect these people personally, it's just these people, they never really meant what they said, or they never really had to put their beliefs to the test. And that's what I feel about like this uncertainty, this initiating sort of a religious transformation, is that people in times when the rug is pulled out from under them, they immediately they cling on to the strongest thing they could find, and in this case that would be the government that's telling them to stay at home, sit down, shut up, and behave. And I recently wrote a chapter for a book that's supposed to be coming out hopefully in a few months, assuming that we're still allowed to read in a few months, in which even the subchapter headings were like sit down, shut up, sell out, pay up, which is just all of these orders that were being given. And in a time of uncertainty, people cling to orders that they're being given. And this is why, you even see some tweets from people who are being honest, which on Twitter, I guess, is a rare enough find, is that people don't necessarily want to go back to work because they've gotten used to just maybe sitting at home. Maybe they're getting unemployment. Maybe there's some of the lucky people who are able to keep themselves at least financially in the black for now. And they don't want to have to go out and scrap for their living, because I don't know. I can't imagine that there are too many people like that. But Twitter, of course, is not the real world, and that's why you have these commentators who are claiming to speak for the working class and saying, "Oh no, we don't want people to go out and die for capitalism." It's not dying for capitalism. It's wanting to have freedom of movement, freedom of assembly. People aren't permitted to even get together, not for work, just for, having a conversation in public is not allowed because some cop is going to come out of nowhere and drag you away from whoever you happen to be talking to. You hug your friend in public, you risk detention of some kind. So I don't know. Have you seen a lot of anti-imperialist commentators abandoning their deeply held beliefs that apparently aren't so deeply held anymore?
Well, you definitely won't get that from Anderson Cooper, who, as we speak, I believe Mr. Cooper is hosting a CNN town hall with Dr. Sanjay Gupta, Dr. quote-unquote Sanjay Gupta, and Bill Gates, who is also a man with no medical expertise who has somehow become America's doctor behind, of course, Dr. Fauci in the time of this pandemic. It's interesting how we were so quick to castigate Dr. Phil because he's not a real doctor, and how we will make sure that every single doctor who speaks publicly about the coronavirus is expected to have a specific background in pandemics rather than just biology and so on. Yet Bill Gates, who has no medical expertise whatsoever, he has become the voice of reason for the American people. But you were asking about imperialist voices. I wrote today at overwritten.org an article explaining that we have not seen any mainstream discussion, or rather any mainstream criticism of the idea that the government should have the right to enforce these kinds of repressive measures. The debate always has to be framed within the assumption that the government is doing this because it has our best interests in mind. It's not. Some people, like the president's supporters, will argue that the government is overreacting or taking the wrong measures, but it's always assumed that the government is acting with the best intentions. The government just wants to protect us, and maybe it's going a little too far. Nowhere in the mainstream, or even in most depths of the alternative media, will you see a commentator argue forcefully that the government has malicious intent here. You will not see that. You see that we are compelled and expected and obligated to give the government the benefit of the doubt. And that is very disturbing. That it plays into a lot of the jingoistic imperialist rhetoric that we see in the lead up to military action. We saw that in the aftermath of 9/11 and the subsequent enactment of the Patriot Act, that some people said, well, this legislation goes too far, but it's just because the government wants to protect us.
So you've seen coronavirus presented as war. I hate to jump in here, but yes. I mean, people like Chris Cuomo saying, this is our World War II, this is us going to the barricades, this is, and literally saying, our forefathers were asked to go and serve, and you're being asked to sit on the couch, so how dare you say this and this and this. I mean, the dude is seriously roided up, and I mean, it's not a pretty sight. But I wanted to get back to what you said earlier about how these doctors that have expertise in pandemics, how we're being asked to put our faith in them. Now, this gets back to the religious aspect, because you would have, in the past at least, these sort of millenarian religions that they would predict the world would end on a certain date. And then when the world didn't end on that day, they had to scramble to come up with an excuse, and they would put forth another one. And their followers would follow them for a certain period of time. But after a while, I mean, eventually the cults would dissolve. But then you've got someone like Fauci, who's been at the head of the NIAID for 40 years now, and he's basically made terrible mistakes for every pandemic that he's been at the helm of. If you look at the AIDS crisis, hundreds of thousands of people got deathly ill, and many, many died because he was pushing AZT as this therapy for HIV, as a prophylactic therapy against HIV. So people who didn't even have AIDS, who may have even been able to live if they had HIV and they were able to keep it from progressing, then he advised this toxic drug in very high doses and killed people. And he screwed up a whole bunch of other things. He screwed up the swine flu response, the pandemic that wasn't. He perjured himself when he said that the influenza vaccine didn't cause encephalitis as a potential side effect. I mean, this is a guy who's basically made the equivalent of predicting the world's going to end every week. And then, whoops, the world doesn't end, and yet we're still told that we have to follow him. So, I mean, how is somebody like this, or even Bill Gates, who was responsible for the epidemic of vaccine strain polio in India and Pakistan, and responsible, allegedly at least, for sterilizing thousands of women in Kenya with a tetanus vaccine that was tainted with human chorionic gonadotrophin, HCG, how are these people able to retain their power? Is it just money, or do they have some sort of religious hold over us?
Well, it's a little bit of both. This pandemic appeals to our collective sense of laziness, which is something that I've been arguing regarding politics, is that we want to bestow our responsibility for action on these politicians. We want to think that the solution to our problems is to walk into a voting booth once every 4 years and check off a name on a piece of paper. If that were the case, that would be wonderful, because it would mean that we can solve the world's problems with very little effort at all. That is what inspires us to put our faith, our quasi-religious faith, as you put it, in people like Dr. Fauci and Bill Gates. Even though we don't know these people personally, we don't know their motivations. Fauci, by the way, is promoting a medication. I don't know exactly how to pronounce it. Is it remdesivir?
Remdesivir? That's how it's spelled, at least. I don't know how it's exactly pronounced.
Yeah, I actually decided to watch a little bit of corporate news media the other day. I watched some Fox and then some CNN, and I saw that this medication that he's promoting is deemed foolproof, in effect, because it lessened the fatality rate in a certain sample of patients from 11% to 8%. And because of this, it has now been heralded as the gold standard, the miracle elixir that we've been searching for the last several weeks, which is interesting because it's just as unfounded as the medications that Donald Trump and some of his supporters and right-wing media have been hawking for the last couple of weeks. But when it comes from Fauci, we're expected to trust him unconditionally. Fauci the other day expressed his great frustration that we have not enacted a nationwide total lockdown where you are not allowed to leave your home except with express orders. This is, as we mentioned earlier, that everybody wants these critics of the current policy to be trained experts in the field of pandemics. Well, Dr. Fauci is certainly not an expert in law, and so why should Dr. Fauci be allowed to comment on what he thinks the arm of the law ought to do to force people into their homes? I mean, to go back to what I was saying earlier, there's no reason why the government should have this much power. There's no reason why the government should have this license to force people into their homes. I don't care if it's the bubonic plague. And by the way, the people who want to compare this to the bubonic plague, the bubonic plague took out approximately 20% of the world's population, which back at the time would have been at least 75 million people. For the coronavirus to be comparable to that, it would have to take out not just 75 million people, but adjusted for world population figures, would have to take out closer to 1.5 billion people.
Don't give them any ideas. Don't give them any ideas.
Yes. Right, and even if the coronavirus were to be exponentially more lethal than it actually is, and even if these lockdown measures were proven to have prevented that, even still, why should the government, which the entire American population is skeptical of the government as long as their preferred political party is not in power, why should the government have that kind of muscle? I mean, that is the real substantive philosophical question that is not being asked, certainly nowhere in the mainstream press.
Well, it's certainly an interesting sort of reversal, because Sweden is one of the few countries that hasn't locked down completely, and we're in a giant case of Stockholm syndrome here. So, I mean, what I'm definitely seeing, at least as far as this whole like cultish aspect, is that, and obviously this was the case before coronavirus, and unfortunately will likely be the case after, is that these medical experts have become our priest class, and they are the ones who are interpreting the word from on high, and that as long as they're giving orders and as long as they sound authoritative, they're allowed to say whatever they want, even if it has no basis in science or if it changes from day to day. I mean, one of the things I found most ridiculous is that YouTube has adopted this policy of not allowing people to say things that contradict what the WHO is saying. Now, the WHO, is this the WHO from now, from April 30th, I think it is? Or is this WHO from January? Because they were saying two completely different things. So if your story changes from month to month, and we're supposed to only adhere to the word of God as translated through the whatever white-coated goon is yelling in our faces to sit down and shut up, it's a little bit ridiculous, and especially when you think that the YouTube removed several copies of a video of two California doctors who were just doing a press conference, speaking from their own experience, speaking from the experience of their clinic, and revealing the statistics that they had found in their own clinic, extrapolating those to the state, but with the qualifications that this is only our experience, this is not everybody, and talking about other statistics that have been recorded in official. So YouTube is now the arbiter of medical fact. You don't need to go to medical school anymore. You just need to be a content moderator for a $8 trillion company that happens to have a lock on most forms of social media communication. I mean, what kind of bullshit is this? I mean, it's a bit absurd, because doctors don't get to be a member of the priest class unless they, I mean, this is like heretics being burned at the stake, but now you're just getting deplatformed. So, I mean, I don't know. What do you think about that?
Well, like any good religion, the coronavirus cult needs to make an example out of the blasphemers, the heretics, the apostates. And also, like any good religion, it encourages incestuous unions. And we see here the incestuous union of media and state, the WHO coming together with YouTube to suppress what they call misinformation. Now, people need to acquire the proper definition of misinformation. Misinformation refers to information that we know to be false and are spreading in order to have a harmful effect. It is rather improbable that that is what these doctors out in California were doing, even if we find that what they said was incorrect, which we don't know that for a fact, by the way. The true hard understanding of this disease has escaped us because it's happening in real time. You mentioned earlier the uncertainty that seems to terrify people. Well, there's a lot to be uncertain about. There's quite a bit that we do not understand as a species and as a society, as much as we like to pat ourselves on the back for thinking that we know everything just because we have access to the internet and can log on to Wikipedia. That doesn't make us omniscient. That doesn't make us God. And also, like any good religion, the coronavirus cult depends on demonization of outsiders. And we see that quite a bit with anybody who is protesting the lockdown measures. Just a few minutes before we started this interview, I went on Twitter and I saw that armed protesters had appeared outside of the Michigan State House earlier today with a poster of Governor Gretchen Whitmer, who may, by the way, be she may be being groomed to be Joe Biden's vice presidential pick, by the way. I saw she did an interview with Anderson Cooper the other day. She was on these posters disfigured to look like Adolf Hitler, and which I don't understand what's inaccurate about that. I mean, she is suppressing the people's freedom of movement and expression. And as for this faux horror that is expressed about armed protesters standing outside the State House, well, I was outside the New Hampshire State House just about 2 weeks ago when we had our own reopen New Hampshire protests, and there were plenty of people standing outside with AR-15s and AK-47s. You don't need to be afraid of these weapons, and even if you are, that's your personal issue, because we do have this thing called the Second Amendment, and it is legal for people to stand out there and protest with those guns. And most ironically, one of the Michigan lawmakers was quoted as saying that she's never been more thankful for the sergeant at arms. In other words, armed security officers and agents of the state standing outside to protect her against the scary people with guns. I mean, the philosophical incoherence and sloppiness of this cult is, I mean, it's like any religion. It's loaded with inconsistencies. It's loaded with conceptual hypocrisies and contradictions, and they have to contort their own logic just to reassure themselves that they're doing the right thing.
Yeah, the fact that the ones with guns, the protesters with guns rather, are the ones who are photographed and used in the media that is then circulated all around the world. I mean, The Guardian had an article, I think last week, I forget which state it was. It might have been Ohio, but they were talking about how all of the protesters who were trying to get their states reopened were far-right loonies who were gun-toting and pro-Trump, and they made very sure to take specific pictures that backed up their narrative. So, of course, you'll see people taking photos of the people with guns, and they'll focus on the ones with flags as if just having a flag suddenly now makes you a far-right loony. I mean,
what kind of flag?
An American flag. These were northern folks, good old northern folks. But of course, The Guardian is a British paper, so I guess maybe I don't know. Surely there are British people who wave the Union Jack around sometimes, once in a while. But you'll never see photos of the cops with their guns, even though, like you said, the governor is very thankful for having their sergeant at arms hanging out around to protect them against the armed loonies with their own armed loonies. But it's very interesting, just the degree of Schadenfreude that you have in also in the media, because you'll see it was in Kentucky. They were talking about how they had gone to protest to open up their state. These people, these southern subhuman, horrible. That's sarcasm for people who can't recognize it. I don't consider Southerners subhuman at all. But these Kentuckians who had gone to try to protest to get their state reopened, and then in the New York Post, the same article, they talk later about, and then there was an explosion of coronavirus cases 2 days later. Now, I don't know about you, but one of the few things we do know about this virus is that generally it takes a little while for it to manifest as far as producing symptoms. Now, yes, it could be in a couple of days, but even this article admitted by the end in kind of, the print was the same size, but it might as well have been in tiny little print. It was mostly in nursing homes, and there's no evidence that the two were linked and blah, blah, blah. But basically, there's these stories have been in the media by the dozens, just talking about how, this person defied the lockdown, and they were really vocal about defying the lockdown, and then they got coronavirus, and they died. And there was one guy whose death was even being mocked publicly on Twitter. I forget his name, but he was an Ohio person, and for all we know, he doesn't even exist, and they were just making up a person to hold up as an example. But he was widely just pilloried as being this sort of horrible monster for daring to go outside and calling out the governor's draconian lockdown orders. And, well, see, he called out fascism for what it was, and so he deserves what he got. It's like, I wrote a little bit about face masks being used as talismans to protect you against the virus, even when people wear them incorrectly or don't wear full protection. But even just accusing your neighbor or snitching on your neighbor, which is another thing that's become widely popular and widely accepted. We went from a culture that hates snitches to one that puts them up on pedestals and congratulates them for a job well done. It's like, as by snitching out your neighbor or by cheering on the virus when it strikes down some disobedient person, then we will somehow keep ourselves safe from the virus. What other kind of talismanic behaviors have you seen? Because they're all over the place.
Well, in New Hampshire, one of the talismans is the gun. The gun shops here are businesses booming at the arms dealerships. And by the way, for people who want to demonize gun owners, New Hampshire, I believe, has the most lenient gun laws in the entire world, and yet we also have one of the lowest rates of violent crime. My friend and I went to the arms dealer the other day, and we were checking out the grenade launcher that you have seen in the film Scarface. Pretty inexpensive. My friend was thinking about filing for the federal certificate that will allow him to own it, and then he can put it on his AR-15, just like Scarface. But anyway, so what was I talking about? Oh, yes. So the talismanic symbols that we see in the coronavirus, obviously the mask is a big one. I remember seeing this, the masks used to be a rarity, but we're seeing them become increasingly ubiquitous. But I think that there are also these measures that are designed just to provide a sense of reassurance to people, even though they don't do anything, kind of like holding garlic to ward off a vampire, or a crucifix to achieve the same, or a black cat walking in a public. Anyway, the thing is that I went to the grocery store today, and the grocery store has been ordering people to stop at the line to the checkout counters and only allow one person in each checkout line at a time. And now the purpose of this is obviously to enforce the 6 feet of distance that is supposedly, we don't know for sure, but supposedly enough to shield against the transmission of the coronavirus. Now, the problem with this is that the queue to the checkout line starts here, but everybody who is in line for the line, they are bunched together with no mandated separation of 6 feet apiece. So in other words, this sense of distancing that is enforced at the checkouts themselves, that is not enforced throughout the rest of the store. So the question is, what is being accomplished, if anything, by forcing people to stay 6 feet apart at the very end of their journey through the grocery store? We also see these arrows that are put on the floor of the grocery store trying to enforce one-way movement through the various aisles. You're supposed to only enter an aisle from a certain angle and exit from another. I don't know if other people have seen this at their grocery stores, but I'm seeing this quite a bit in New Hampshire. Have you seen this over at your neck of the woods?
We don't have them in the grocery stores, at least none of the ones that I go to, but I've seen that in Massachusetts, they have them even on the sidewalk. Now, Massachusetts is a notoriously rule-obsessed sort of psychosis that they've got going on there. Now, I can say this, I lived there for 5 years, I've experienced it, it's a very disturbed place. But,
and I'm a New Hampshireite. We always have our long-standing rivalry with Massachusetts.
Yeah, Massachusetts.
Why we're better than them.
Messed up place. And yeah, this town that's, I guess, about 45 minutes outside of Boston. I'm not exactly familiar with the place. Beverly, I think it's called. But they've got one-way sidewalks, and the cops are talking about, oh well, we like it, and we think we're going to keep it around after the virus is over. And it's just, all of this stuff is going to be kept around after the virus is over. New York, we just heard they're going to close the subways from 1 to 4 a.m. so they can clean up the homeless people who are supposedly all camped out in the subways. Now, I've seen the photos they've tried to use as, oh yes, this is a big explosion in the homeless population. Now, they don't look any different than any other like late night view of the subways. Yeah, some homeless people stay in there. New York is a very expensive place to live, and more people are getting kicked out of their homes. And now they're being rustled up if they try to stay outside. Where do you think they're going to go? So this is absurd. This is an excuse for something they've been wanting to do for a really, really long time. The MTA budget, the MTA is one of the most corrupt organizations in the country, and that's really saying something. They were long kept 2 sets of books. They got caught doing it. They went back to doing it. It's ridiculous. And they've never had enough money because everybody's always skimming their own little piece off the top. And because it's the state that's responsible for giving them the money, it's the city that actually knows how much money they need. It's a mess. And they've wanted to cut back on 24-hour service. We're the one subway system in the country that has 24-hour service. This I take deeply personally because it's one of the reasons that I moved to the city. I like being able to get around 24 hours without having to have a car. It's very expensive to live here, et cetera, et cetera. Basically, they've taken one of the last remaining features that made this city anything worth living in and trashed it in the name of coronavirus. It's not coming back. It's not going to come back. Everything that's going away, everyone that thinks that this is okay, like the Patriot Act, like you were talking about, because, oh, well, this is just temporary, we need to fight scary, scary virus. Scary, scary virus is the invisible enemy. We must take up arms against it. But because it's invisible, our arms are, metaphorical and just consist of, taking your freedoms and curb stomping them. So it's really insulting that we're being asked to do this again because, I don't know. I was relatively young when 9/11 happened, and I wasn't in any sort of position to take up political action against it. But even at that age, I kind of knew something was fishy, but didn't know what it was and wouldn't pretend to, I had no idea. But it's like, we lived through 9/11. We saw what happened next. And the fact that people are not speaking up about this because I don't know if they're all legitimately scared or if they're more scared of being called out as a heretic. Or, would you say that people are actually falling for this narrative? Or do you think that people are just afraid of groupthink, the spiral of silence, that whole phenomenon that I've talked about before on this channel and to you?
Well, before we get into that, I just want to say that every time I come out to visit you in New York, I love riding through the extremely sketchy Brooklyn subway system. And if they didn't clean up the subway system over the homeless man whose dog's bowels exploded like a balloon the last time I came out to see you, I don't know why they would bother about coronavirus. Personally, I'm less terrified of the latter. But as for why people are doing this, I think it fuels their sense of narcissism. At the beginning of this video, I talked about Freud's conception of religion as providing a sense of paternalistic protection to the perpetually infantile. I think that there's also a narcissistic element to that, an idea that the world revolves around you. And with the coronavirus, we can see ourselves as the protagonist of the Hollywood post-apocalyptic horror film of your choosing. There's definitely a great sense of being the star of the show, of being the one who's going to survive through plucky, kind of not a sense of being an alpha male, because if you notice, the alpha males usually don't last long in those films. It's usually the plucky underdog who just submits and stays under the radar and does what he or she is told for just long enough in order to master the situation. And that is what we're seeing here with the coronavirus. People want to think that they're important, that the fate of the world hangs in the balance of your particular action. And that is why people are doing what the government tells them to do, because they think that they can make a difference. There was that popular GIF that went around of the match that steps out of the line of fire and avoids causing a widespread conflagration.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yes, and there is something to be said about that, but the problem here is that people are sacrificing any sense of personal autonomy. Nobody is advocating for recklessness or wanton selfishness or a disregard for the general social welfare. That would be called living like a normal American. What we've been doing for the 250 years of our history has been ignoring the social welfare and putting other people at risk for our own personal gain. So this sudden obsession with the collective well-being of our fellow man and woman is a pretty novel innovation for the American people. This, of course, brings to mind what I was reading in Mein Kampf, where Hitler talks about how the sense of humanitarianism is only dedicated towards our certain favored few, which is reinforcing what you mentioned earlier, that when those who disagree with the narrative and they insist that the coronavirus poses no real threat at all, when those people succumb to the virus and die, we engage in a kind of bloodthirsty schadenfreude, where we say, yes, how wonderful it is that this apostate died by his own infidelity and by his own skepticism, how wonderfully righteous it is. And that reveals that we don't have any compassion, we don't have any empathy, and we don't have any regard for the common welfare. It's just that we want to feel important in this situation. And so that moral inconsistency is one of the reasons why so many people are becoming skeptical of this. And that, of course, leads us to a topic that we absolutely should not disregard, and I'll let you introduce this one, is the idea that people should just stay at home even if they are financially incapable of doing so. You mentioned the great Governor Cuomo, His High Excellency Governor Cuomo, saying that people just need to stay inside because it's not about you, it's about me. How out of touch can these people be to say that people need to stay inside when they are failing to provide the basic needs of sustenance?
That's a very good question. And yes, it's almost like they want to start a class war, because you've got people like Nancy Pelosi doing these videos where she is eating her $12 pint of ice cream in front of her $25,000 fridge, 2 fridges. Now, I don't know if it's $25,000 together. I'm not up on my fridge prices, but the fact is that it costs more than several used cars. And it's, I can't imagine that all of these, between Nancy Pelosi and between Cuomo saying, oh, it's not about you, it's about me, and you owe this to me because I've taken such great care of you by cutting Medicaid for the last 9 years that I've been governor. I mean, Cuomo especially just really sticks in your craw because he's talking about how, oh yes, the healthcare workers, I love the healthcare workers. That's why I've cut so many of their jobs, and that's why I've shuttered so many hospitals from my real estate buddies. And then you've got de Blasio, too, talking about how, oh, well, you know, I just talked to the guy at Macy's, and Macy's is really special to us. And, you know, we're going to try to get the fireworks going for July 4th, because even if you're in lockdown, you can still see them, you know, the holiday where you're supposed to celebrate your freedom. Oh, from lockdown, 3 months from now. Oh, that's a great idea, de Blasio. So I don't know if they're trying to get people to rebel or pick up their pitchforks and at least make some noise. I don't know what the answer is to that question. But the fact is that they're still talking about this rugged individualism, at least not using those words anymore, but talking about how, oh, we're all in this together, but there's something conspicuously missing there, which is where the rugged individualism would go if they actually, I mean, the minute they start saying that, then you know it's pitchfork time. At least they want it to be pitchfork time. They're definitely expecting something, and I don't know exactly where this is going, but I do see a sort of apocalyptic punishment. They keep talking about a second wave and how, oh, well, if we're not careful, there's going to be a second wave. And you see now Georgia is unlocking and letting people come back out, and some other states in the South are starting to let people come back out. You just know what's going to happen next, and you know it's going to be presented because Bill Gates is, of course, one of the loudest voices talking about this, not even just about a second wave, but about a bioterror attack. And that's what I'm a little bit afraid of. Not that there's going to be some actual terrorist who comes out of nowhere and shocks everybody, but that there's going to be a bioterror attack just in time to start a war with Iran for the election, because, you know, that's what Donald Trump is going to do. And I don't know, I don't like to be right about these things, but the fact that I predicted this pandemic thing, you know, just a few weeks before it happened is, I think I can kind of, I can safely say that this is what they want to do. And I'm hoping that if I make enough noise about it, if other people make enough noise about it, watch the Bill Gates interview with, Stephen Colbert. He did a thing like the other day, and he's talking about how, well, Stephen asks him in his, you know, it's funny because Stephen Colbert used to be like willing to really take the piss out of like George W. Bush was like who he was originally formed to be sort of a parody of. And now he has come full circle and he is George W. Bush. So he's saying, oh, well, you predicted that pandemic back in 2015. Well, now what's the next thing you're going to predict? And he's talking about a bioterror attack. So it's like, if enough people come out and if people start enjoying themselves outdoors again as the weather gets warm and everybody thinks that, oh, yes, we don't have to social distance anymore. We don't have to wear these stupid masks. You know, let's just, you know, live free. And then, whoops, that's when the second wave is going to hit. No, this is not to be said that this is going to be a natural thing. Not at all. There's nothing natural about this to begin with, and there's nothing natural about this for that. But I am a little bit concerned that this whole religious aspect is leading to and it was written that there would be divine punishment for those who violated the social distancing. And then it came to pass, and the virus smote them down, and they were infected. And we all came running back to Bill Gates saying, please, please give us our vaccines, Bill, please, please. It's disgusting. And Michael Bloomberg is also involved in the contact tracing program for New York that they've now decided to roll out. Speaking of snitching, sorry, that's kind of apropos of nothing, but I was just thinking of extremely rich plutocrats wearing sweater vests, and Bloomberg has now taken up the sweater vest look. So he's getting on board the whole, let's be the kindly uncle plutocrat with our Orwellian programs to just completely rip out the last few shreds of freedom in the tapestry of our nation. But yeah, he's collaborating with Cuomo to recruit a whole bunch of human contact tracers, because it recently came out that more than half, at least, of Americans will not use the Apple Google contact tracing program that they're trying to insert into the operating system, so you don't have a question of whether to use it. So they want to use humans, and Bloomberg is paying for it. But yeah, what do you think about these prophecies?
Well, actually, Whitney Webb has done quite a bit of great writing at Mint Press News. I understand she's no longer affiliated with that website, but she wrote quite a bit last year about various proposals that the Department of Justice was making under William Barr's direction, talking about the suppression of civil liberties, the possibility to detain Americans indefinitely, which many of us thought was already on the books in most of the 21st century. But now we find that the government conveniently finds justification to enact or at least consider this legislation amidst the coronavirus, much like how the Patriot Act was clearly under development for quite some time before the Twin Towers fell. I just wanted to say this before I forget. Stephen Colbert, I am so glad that Jon Stewart resigned from The Daily Show. His last episode of The Daily Show was coincidentally the same night that Donald Trump appeared in his first Republican presidential debate. And I'm so glad that Jon Stewart quit at that point, because in my days of intellectual infancy, I actually really enjoyed Jon Stewart, and Stephen Colbert, and to see what Stephen Colbert has become in the Trumpish age is just so disheartening. He truly is one of the most repulsive mouthpieces of the establishment, and apologist for which. But as for the prophecy, you know, what's interesting about the coronavirus pandemic is that it is fundamentally different from previous pandemics like SARS in 2003 and swine flu and bird flu and Disney measles and all of the rest. It's fundamentally different because you can't just shut off your television and ignore it. I think we've discussed that previously. The problem is that you can't just turn off your TV and shut down your phone and forget about it. It is everywhere you go. You are constantly reminded of the threat that this virus supposedly poses. And that is something that Hitler also discussed in Mein Kampf. Hitler talked about how in order to make propaganda effective against the enemy, and of course Donald Trump and many others are referring to this as the invisible enemy, you have to repeat the same superficial, simplistic message over and over again. And Hitler pointed out that after 4.5 years of this message, Germany was ready for a kind of political revolution. It's not at all unfathomable to think that if we put people in this state of insanity for long enough that they will eventually snap. Does snapping mean an armed rebellion against the government? No, snapping could mean our spirit is broken and we finally submit to the dishonest chicanery that is promoted by the state. It's a form of psychological torture comparable to locking somebody in solitary confinement. I mean, this is what they say in the introduction to The Shining. It's what the old timers used to call cabin fever, that terrible sense of isolation that occurs when people are locked together for long periods of time. And this is a massive social experiment, what we're seeing here, to test the will of the American people. And you mentioned the idea of the prophecy of bioterrorism. What also separates this disease from previous artificial and manufactured crises like the war on terror or something similar is that the coronavirus does not have a spokesman. The coronavirus does not have personification, at least not yet. After 9/11, the government tried to demonize Muslims and Arabs, but it didn't take too long before Muslims and Arabs stood up and said, hey, wait a minute, I'm a Muslim and an Arab and I'm not a terrorist. And we had to say, oh, okay. Or if our government tries to demonize the government of Iran, it doesn't take too long before the president of Iran can step forward and say, hey, wait a minute, this is not correct. The coronavirus cannot argue with us. The coronavirus cannot speak in criticism of our propaganda. And in fact, I believe there was an Italian politician who went on, I believe it was MSNBC, just a few weeks before America went into its lockdown phase, AKA the period of the suspension of the Bill of Rights. And he said, he made sure to say that this is fundamentally different from a terrorist attack, because after a terrorist attack, we should go out in public and say we are not afraid, but the coronavirus does not listen to that. I think that this is a far more effective means and tool of propaganda than any kind of physical threat, any kind of solid threat like a person or a foreign government, because it cannot speak in its defense.
Very much so. I would agree with that. I mean, it's omniscient and omnipotent. It can appear anywhere that it wants to, and it can be personalized when it has to be. I mean, you've got Trump more and more saying that this is China's fault, that we need to get reparations from China, and when that stops working, then they can, kind of step back and then maybe shift the blame onto, well, this would be around the time the second wave would come, shift the blame onto the anti-lockdown protesters and say those disobedient people whose names are all on, as Whitney Webb wrote, the main core database, or all of these other databases that they have of dissidents that they plan to round up in a time of unrest, which, I mean, we're going to be in a time of unrest for the various reasons that we've already discussed and for many, many more. But this is the fact that the virus does not have a spokesperson or a definitive identity means that you can make anyone you want to be the virus. And that's pretty scary because, I mean, you hear about these hate crime attacks on Asian Americans, and that's bad enough. But trying to start a Cold War Part 2 against China is that's going to lead to even more economic hurt for the Americans who depend on the trade with China for their jobs and for their industries. And just the fact that already the economic suffering is going to be blamed on China, and you get everybody ginned up and screaming, and then it's the people who deserve the pitchforks do not get the pitchforks.
Let me just say a brief word about that. You've been talking about Trump demanding reparations from China, which is absurd. I mean, the United States has exported so many menaces and evils that have caused so much, not only physical destruction, but economic destruction. It's rather laughable for the United States to demand, take pity on me for I am an orphan. I find it fascinating that the federal government, and I'm not by any means the first person to speak about this, the idea that the government thinks a $1,200 check is sufficient for putting people out of work. Go talk to somebody who manages Medicaid programs. People on ALS living in their apartment buildings whose caregivers cannot come out and take care of them anymore, those because of the coronavirus, those people are somehow able to survive on a measly $1,200 check in order to acquire their own personal care, their own LNA services. I mean, it's a tasteless joke.
Just so you know, nobody knows what any of those abbreviations mean, just so you know.
Oh, well, that's okay. But what is not okay is the idea that the government in this situation is prohibiting people from going to work and yet demanding the same fulfillment of contracts, whether it be with their landlord, their utility companies, even their cable companies, the grocery store. I mean, I know they don't have a contract with the grocery store, but you understand what I mean. And this is, my criticism here is perfectly compatible with libertarianism. I mean, we're not saying that the government should bail people out because they're having a bad time. We're saying that the government has blocked millions upon millions of Americans from sustaining themselves financially, and yet the government is not willing to provide any kind of financial support. I mean, it reminds me of when I was in high school, we had a poster in my civics classroom explaining how the various means of economics worked. And it was always the analogy of the farmer with his cow. And under capitalism, you have two cows, you sell one and buy a bull. Under communism, you have two cows, your neighbors help with take care of the cows, and you all share the milk. Fascism was illustrated as you have two cows, the government shoots you and takes both of them. That is precisely what we are seeing here.
Except now you've got the government shooting you and taking your cows and shooting them too.
Yes, this is fascism, and this is not free market laissez-faire economics. This is fascism, where the government is, by the power of the state, prohibiting you from working, and yet by the same power of the state enforcing contractual obligations. It is absurd, and that doesn't even bother to get into the transfer of wealth that many other writers have spoken about.
That's a pretty big part. But what I was saying about the shooting the cows, I'm serious. They're telling farmers to put their animals down, and they're creating a food shortage by saying you can't go to work at your meat packing plant, or you can't harvest your vegetables. I'm sorry, what kind of farmers are 5 feet away from each other, or even 4 or even 6 feet away from each other? If you're harvesting vegetables, you've got plenty of space and you're outdoors. I mean, this is ridiculous. They're creating the situation for food shortages. They've been predicting this in the media for weeks now, ever since that first meat packing plant, Smithfield in Iowa or something, in Nebraska, somewhere in the Midwest, had an outbreak of coronavirus, and they were saying, well, this meat plant only provides 5% of all of the pork in America. And I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't eat pork. But that was supposed to be the implication was that we're all going to be experiencing food shortages soon. And then you saw after that there were, okay, well, people's vegetables are being left to rot in the ground, people's fruit is being left to rot on the vine, and more you're actually seeing this because people are being prevented from actually, harvesting things, slaughtering their animals, giving their milk, and it's because the restaurants
destroying their products. We saw the milk
literally pouring the milk, and all of this is filmed in living color. So we're all being conditioned to expect this catastrophe, and now Trump is trying to say that they're going to get the meat packing people back to work, but it's a little bit late for that, I'm afraid. And as much as I don't want to see a food shortage, but you're very much, this is like, again, the second one of these apocalyptic sort of events that we're being conditioned to accept, and it will be our fault for defying the lockdowns. They're going to assume that we don't remember this whole food shortage thing in a few months in the future when it actually happens, and when everyone's been on lockdown, and then, oh, well, this is what you get. See, this is what you get. And I wanted to get back to what you said earlier about the largest psychological experiment. Well, the World Economic Forum, which was actually the one of the hosts of the Event 201 predictive programming event that most of us are familiar with, but if you're not, they held it at Johns Hopkins University, which of course is right near the CDC, and it's where they've been keeping all the statistics for the coronavirus. But it was a simulation of a coronavirus pandemic that was held in conjunction with American leaders, business leaders, people like the World Health Organization's Mike Ryan, who's talked about kicking in doors and dragging people's family members out if they're infected with coronavirus. And so the fact that this World Economic Forum is even writing about how this is the largest psychological experiment in history, and this is really bad. It's actually going to have a mental health epidemic. Well, maybe you should have thought of that before. And of course, even worse than that is the Rockefeller Foundation, which financed the 2010 lockstep scenario, which basically predicted this, what's going on right now, to a letter, has come out with Harvard and released a plan to unlock down the country. The Rockefeller Foundation and Harvard. Where have I seen those two names together? And it's a little bit ridiculous that this stuff is being rubbed in our face. And if we even pointed out, well, then you're a conspiracy theorist. What are you? Are you against the lockdown? Because, you know, I mean, you're killing grandma. And just the amount of shame that is now put on people who dare to go against the narrative just for pointing out what's right in front of your face. It's really bad. And the fact that they're now pro-clutching and saying, oh, well, you know, this is a psychological experiment. Well, you knew that going into it, didn't you? The whole depriving people of vitamin D, depriving them of human contact, depriving them of even exercise for their immune system, guaranteed the second wave is going to be worse. And that's the whole point.
Yes. Yeah, you mentioned earlier all the animals that the government, the livestock that the government is ordering to be slaughtered for no reason at all, except for a suspicion of having contracted the coronavirus. I've been reading the Bible for over a year now, a chapter a day, because I can't tolerate anymore. It's so agonizing. And there's obviously plenty of discussion about the sin offering and the meat offering and the burnt offering and the peace offering and the free will offering, where maybe this is part of that prophecy that you've been speaking about throughout this video. But regarding the great social experiment, I wrote today at overwritten.org in the same article I mentioned earlier that the government is paying very close attention to this, and the government is quite reassured by what it sees. The authoritarian forces within our federal government, they are seeing that the American people are not really rebelling. I mean, sure, they're having their little demonstrations, though only approved with permits, of course, and they might be coming out with their guns, but they're not actually engaging in armed rebellion. This is not the whiskey's rebellion of the 21st century. And the relative docility and obsequiousness and acceptance of the American people is very reassuring, especially because, and this is very important, in the overwhelming majority of the country, violating the lockdown orders comes only with a slap on the wrist, relatively speaking. The misdemeanor charges are expected to be thrown out, and you might face some kind of a fine, but the charges are pretty light, all things considered. Now, and yet despite this, the American people are completely accepting of the orders, and they're refusing to violate them for fear of penalty. Could you imagine if the government ordained that every single person who violated these statutes would be charged with a felony? Could you imagine if they were to be threatened with prison time? The government only has to threaten to wag its finger in our face, and we immediately cower and say, yes, master, I know my place. And that is very disconcerting for anybody who actually wants to create any kind of revolution. But it is, by extension, very reassuring and, in fact, very inspiring to an authoritarian state that wants to squeeze us and finally revoke whatever meager civil liberties we have retained in the 21st century.
Well, about the fines, though, I mean, people can't afford even a meager fine because people are out of work and they're not getting any money coming in many cases. And also, this is an interesting point because the fact that now the Democrats want to give $2,000 every month as universal basic income, which I think as a stopgap measure is a good idea because, like I said, people are not getting funds coming in any other way except if they're lucky enough to get on the unemployment rolls. But what that means is that people are even more hesitant to break the rules of the government because the government is the one giving them this bounty, and if they rely on the government for what they need to feed their family, then of course they're going to shy away from even small acts of rebellion, lest those acts cause the government to withdraw such bounty. So, I mean, I wrote about this in the chapter that I would really like to get released soon because I keep talking about it and nobody can read it. So, but yeah, I wrote about it a bit. That is that by taking this bounty, which of course people need, and I'm not suggesting that they refuse the bounty or that the government stop giving the bounty. I do think this is needed as a stopgap measure, but it does also make us participants in our own oppression. So people need to get over that sort of dichotomy, and I don't know, you can still rebel, take the check, cash it, and go out with your pitchfork. But what I wanted to say was that as far as the government being able to closely monitor people's reactions and whatnot, this is why the fact that everything is now being conducted over platforms like this, over social media, it allows the government to monitor people on a very granular scale so that every individual's reaction can be monitored. It can be synthesized and put through these AI machine learning programs so that when the government puts out its new policies, it looks like, oh, well, they must have read our minds, or, oh, it's a prophecy that came true. And it's interesting because I do think that this sort of like this effort to read the nation's mind and to do these things on a granular scale we're going to be seeing more and more of this. And it's going to be, oh, well, they must know everything, or especially as the contact tracers go out, the human ones and the digital ones. I don't know what's going to happen when they put it in the operating system. If some third-party company is developing an alternate operating system for iOS or Android or any of these, you're going to make a lot of money, because I don't think people are going to want anything to do with this. But, you know, I mean, people are pretty spineless right now, so maybe I'm wrong.
Well, it's the concept of the technological God. I mean, going back to the concept of the cult, it's that God will see every single thing you do, and God can even read the uncertainty in your heart. I've been seeing that quite a bit in the interminable chapters that I've been reading as of late. And the point is brought home over and over again. And it's clear that the authoritarian state models itself in many ways on the concept of the God complex. Now, you mentioned earlier the Democrats pushing for a form of universal basic income. I suspect that this is going to be necessary at some point. Chris Hedges has warned that the life and the plight of Amazon workers is probably going to be the future for many, many
Yes.
Americans, because as we are forced into these positions of drudgery and we are unable to support ourselves by the standards of living that we enjoy at present, we are going to have to reduce our means, and it is entirely possible that we're going to be living in these shanty towns, living in these little shacks, these kinds of tiny houses that we've seen every once in a while on various television programs. And we will be living in these close clustered dens of sickness, infection, and poverty, while we toil the hours away for our corporate overlords. And for those who think that that's some kind of dystopian fantasy, you should recognize that that was happening quite a bit in the early 20th century. Upton Sinclair wrote about that to a certain degree in The Jungle, but John Steinbeck wrote about that at a in very vivid detail in The Grapes of Wrath. You wonder why Americans are discouraged from reading. And as we saw in my interview with Sofia Zaldivar, American high school students are oftentimes not assigned literature at all because they don't want to read about these revolutionary ideas, like the idea that people should have any kind of basic decent standard of living. So people who think that that can't happen, it's already been the reality in this country for quite some time. I just retweeted earlier today the Union Leader, which is one of New Hampshire's few remaining newspapers. We talk about the lack of independent media, but that's a whole different kettle of fish. The Union Leader mentioned today that there's been an eruption of homeless camps that have propped up around the Amoskeag River because presumably of the widespread poverty that is being affected by, not by the coronavirus, but by the government's response to the coronavirus. Just the other day, a friend of mine was assaulted at knife point here in New Hampshire by a homeless person living out near, I think it was the Winnipesaukee River. And I don't blame, I'm not going to demonize the homeless man in this situation, because you see the degradation and eradication of many of these former mill towns in the broader Lakes region and Belknap County. I mean, this friend of mine lives in Franklin, New Hampshire, which is ridiculed widely for its lack of basic infrastructure, its terrible educational system, its total lack of employment opportunities. The thing is, we like to think, oh, well, that just started in the 90s with NAFTA. No, Franklin has been devastated in its infrastructure since basically right around the time of the Great Depression. Franklin never recovered from that. Other towns like Laconia, which is another town in New Hampshire that has been totally wasted in recent years, that may have held on a little bit longer, but I'm not sure that these towns are going to survive in the aftermath of the government's response to the coronavirus. I mean, to go back to Chris Hedges, he talks about, I believe it's, what is that town in New Jersey that's notorious?
Camden, New Jersey. Camden.
Yeah, it's notorious for its open air drug markets and its ridiculous violent crime. I mean, we could be seeing that here in New Hampshire. I said earlier that New Hampshire has one of the lowest violent crime rates in the entire nation, but it might not be for long if we see this happening. And it's not going to be because of our lenient gun laws. It's going to be because of what the federal government has done to rip us apart at the seams.
And that's where New York is headed to. Again, I mean, New York was the bad old days. They talk about the 1970s and even into the 1980s, but this whole shutting down the subways between 1 and 4 a.m., that's going to force some people, night shift workers, to get cars or to just move out of the city altogether and go live somewhere else. And more, I mean, you think, oh, well, the rich people are just going to move in. Well, no, actually they're not, because the Manhattan is, if you go through Midtown Manhattan and some of these areas where the condos have sold for record-breaking millions and millions of dollars in price, you go through there after 6 or 7 p.m. when everybody's gone home, it's a ghost town because nobody actually lives in them. They're places for people who live in other countries to park their money if they don't feel like their money is safe at home, or if they think it'll be too closely inspected by their own governments. Nobody lives in these buildings. Maybe a few people, of course, yes, live in these buildings, or people who live all over the country, maybe they have a place and they spend a few weeks there. But this is not, Manhattan is not, the future is not for people to actually be living there. People can work remotely. All of these people have their jobs who are working for investment banks or working for law firms or other big dollar occupations. They're not working from their offices right now. They're doing it remotely. And then if they live in Manhattan, sure, but I think more and more of them have escaped to their places in the Hamptons. I mean, we were all joking about Escape from New York, that the film where Manhattan has become a giant like prison city. And obviously, yes, these people are going to keep their multi-million-dollar apartments, so it's not quite going to be like that, but the actual people living in Manhattan, they're going to be driven further and further underground. They're turning them out of the subways, but more of these homeless encampments is what you'll be seeing. Now, New York is not, well, it has a reputation of being a dangerous place. It's not one. It hasn't been one since the 1970s, but I can easily see it turning into a Camden-esque situation as people, I mean, this eviction moratorium is only supposed to last for 3 months. What happens at the end of 3 months? You really think that Cuomo, whose nickname is Governor 1%, that he is going to forgive people's rents? I mean, people will be lucky if he forgives their mortgages, but even then, I mean, nobody who lives in Brooklyn or Manhattan has a mortgage unless they're extremely wealthy or they moved here 30, 40 years ago. And so I don't see New York as recovering from this at all. This is going to slide back into the bad old days. And maybe eventually, after everybody has been wiped out, maybe they'll use it as a testing ground for, like Israel uses Gaza to test various biological weapons. Maybe Manhattan's homeless people will be used as a test population. I mean, it's not like the NYPD doesn't already train over there to learn how to treat the local poor and black populations like Israel treats Palestinians. So I can easily see more and more parallels between the oppressed people over there and the ones over here, because I don't see any other way for this to work. If you release a weapon in the air, then everybody's breathing the same air. So even if unless they just hide in their rooms all day, and the rich are not going to put up with that. So yeah, they'll increasingly move out, and it will eventually just be a free for all. And I'm going to get out before that happens, but some people don't have that option.
The mortgage concept is especially ludicrous because as a mortgage holder myself, I'm not supposed to say that based on what an advertisement I saw when I was watching corporate news the other day, warning you about people stealing your mortgages, which is a pretty interesting concept. Wow. We won't get into that. We won't get into that. But the thing is, most people when they get a mortgage, they're entering into a 30-year program. The idea that the banks, who have already received a massive bailout, by the way, cannot extend the mortgage by a few months when you're talking about a 3-decade plan is simply absurd. It's ridiculous no matter how you cut it. If a person has 30 years left on their mortgage, what does a few more months make? Conversely, if a person has only 6 months left on their mortgage, the bank is almost completely repaid. So what does a few more months difference make? The idea that the banks, who, as I said, they've already received a bailout, so they've already been covered as far as what they were expecting to rake in for the rest of the year. The fact that the American people have not seen a corresponding forgiveness of their mortgage payments for that same period is simply asinine, and that is the definition of economic fascism that we mentioned earlier. I'm just going to say this right now because I don't care. My mortgage is through Wells Fargo currently. It's been sold to 3 different banks since I bought this place, by the way. It's a little interesting how mortgages work. Wells Fargo, who of course that institution has been bagged several times for its corrupt and frankly illegal practices that have occurred over the last several years. Wells Fargo currently holds this mortgage. Now, if Wells Fargo received bailout money that would cover even 1 month of my mortgage payment, then by logic would tell you that that 1 month of my mortgage payment should be forgiven, but it has not been. My mortgage remains exactly the same as it was before the coronavirus pandemic. Now, to be fair, when I go on to make my monthly payments, I am told that if I am under financial difficulties at the present moment, I can request, not demand, but request an extension or a delay. But I haven't seen any kind of reduction at all in my total lump sum. And that is which raises the question, why did Wells Fargo require any kind of bailout in the first place? People have spoken about this on Twitter. This is what people mean when they talk about the transfer of wealth. Wells Fargo just received a multi-month, if not multi-year, head start on me. So you talk about trickle-down economics. Have we not discredited that as we have many other religious myths? And just one other thing I want to say about mortgages. Right across the street from my office, there's a former church that was within the last couple of years converted into luxury condominiums by some kind of corrupt real estate developer. I don't know what they go for, but they're probably, each unit is probably at least twice what I paid for this place. Something tells me that is not consistent with the notion of Christian charity.
Well, I mean, it's converted to condos. It loses its sanctity once the people start moving in. But as far as trickle-up economics, which is what we're seeing here, it's the people are the only ones who are expected to actually adhere to the rules of economics as we were taught them. As far as what we're told makes our country run, this invisible hand, this free market baloney. Malarkey, to use Biden's ridiculous term, but this idea that we're actually supposed to respect the value of money and how there's only a finite supply and we have to, scrimp and save and bootstrap ourselves. Well, everybody else gets free money. Everybody else is socialism for literally everybody except the people who legitimately could use some socialism. Socialism for the rich, socialism for giant corporations, socialism for corrupt industries, and little people will throw you a $1,200 crumb here and there. And I mean, of course, nobody can survive on that. That's ridiculous, especially in a large city where things actually cost a significant amount of money. And supposedly you're paying for the privilege of not having to have a car. But I'm harping on the subway thing too much because it's personally upsetting to me. But as far as trickling up economics goes, the transfer of wealth, if you look at who's responsible for reopening the economy, who the president has got on his economic reopening council, is these CEOs of large corporations like JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, McDonald's, Home Depot, giant corporations that are eager to slurp up small businesses. And they're already doing it. I mean, Dwayne Reed, Walgreens, CVS, well, Dwayne Reed and Walgreens, I guess, are the same company already, but yeah, Walgreens, CVS, already accumulated a huge bounty of small pharmacies. You've got in New York, you've got McKinsey and Deloitte, who are the 2 largest management consultancies, or at least 2 of the largest management consultancies. McKinsey, of course, was the one that was responsible for the totally bogus model of ICU beds that was supposedly New York was going to need 80,000 of these damn things, that they never ended up using much more than 5,000. I think maybe 5,100 at most. But this, normally when you make a terrible mistake like that, that causes the lockdown and utter destruction of a city's economy, you get punished. But no, these guys were rewarded with another big contract. So yeah, McKinsey, Deloitte, representatives of Blackstone Group, which is responsible for some of the worst housing abuses after the 2008 crash. You read the stories, even mainstream media wrote about this stuff. It's utterly rapacious behavior. I mean, the word vulture capitalism was coined to describe people like this, just slapping fee after fee because they have to give increasingly high profits to the shareholders every year. People who don't get thrown out onto the street end up wishing they had been, because they end up just pissing away every last cent that they've ever owned, and they thought they were a homeowner. Well, whoops, too bad. No, you're not. And it's really bad, because that was what happened in 2008. And now they're giving people the control of not just housing, but businesses. So all these businesses, I go out on my bike and I see moving trucks on every block. And this was a couple of weeks ago. So that, I'm sure if I go out again on one of these long rides, I'll see many, many more. But you've got, Blackstone, what was the other one? It was another big private equity company, but those two, and then the two management consultancies who specialize in turnaround, which was, bankruptcy. Turnaround is a nice euphemism, meaning we eviscerate the guts of your company, fire all your employees, and then make it profitable for our shareholders.
I thought the moving companies were holding corpses. That's what I read in the Daily Beast today about the U-Haul full of corpses.
Oh, God. Yeah, I read about that. You know, I have no idea what happened there, but they publicized the hell out of these stories because, you got to scare people. You know, if you don't behave, you'll end up in the back of a moving truck. And I mean, I've never seen such a thing. I know where Utica Avenue is, but I've never seen anything like that.
Every single major real estate holder just, I've never heard of one that I actually respected. It began with Donald Sterling back in 2014 when he was outed. He was the owner of the Los Angeles Clippers, who had to sell the team after he was caught making racist comments, despite the fact that he had been a racist slumlord for several decades, constantly complaining about the way that black people smell and how black tenants attracted vermin. These are things that were on the record for several years. The NBA knew about this and how he extorted tenants, probably forced many of them into sexual acts, and it was only when he made racially insensitive comments about Magic Johnson that he was finally forced to sell his team. So then we go from him to other wonderful real estate developers like Donald Trump and Warren Buffett, and don't forget Jeffrey Epstein, who, by the way, was before he tragically killed himself. It's a shame that he did not have appropriate mental health counseling in prison, and we really need to launch an investigation into that. He was a close friend of Bill Gates, by the way. Bill Gates went to the legendary island. Whitney Webb talked about this in a fascinating video with Tim Dillon that people should watch. And these are the kinds of people who are attracted to property management, to real estate holdings, to land development. These are the kinds of people that this industry attracts, and we wonder why these people happily accept bailout money that they neither need nor deserve.
Yeah, and especially even someone like Steve Mnuchin, we're supposed to trust him, like some people who are fans of Trump saying, oh, he's gonna claw back that money, the small business bailout money that inexplicably went to large businesses, even though there was a giant loophole written into it so that it would specifically go to chain restaurants and chain hotels, because the president owns a chain of hotels, and so, well, duh, who could have ever imagined that anything like that would happen? But yeah, Steve Mnuchin is responsible for throwing thousands of families out of their homes in 2008, and so we're supposed to think that this guy is he's gonna be the noble crusader for financial justice for Americans. It's just so pathetic that people have no memory of any of this. And yeah, of course, real estate is what attracts these parasitic types, because if you just deleted the entire real estate industry, well, I mean, people would notice a difference, but it would just be because their bank account had larger numbers at the end of the month, and they'd be like, maybe we didn't need those real estate types after all. It's ridiculous.
I have to introduce what might be a total non sequitur. I thought I heard you say the word restaurant at some point.
I did. Yes.
Okay. This might be a total non sequitur, but I have to bring this up. And if this gets me Epsteined, I'm kidding, of course. But it's just, I have to say this. I am an 11-year survivor of the food service industry, worked in many different capacities at many different restaurants throughout my time. the fact that the restaurants are allowed to remain in operation in the time of the pandemic shows you that there is definitely something fishy going on here. People who have never worked in restaurants, if you actually think for a second that the employees at your favorite restaurant wear gloves, then this is another version of the infantile, paternalistic support and fantasy that we were talking about earlier. Yeah, restaurant employees do not wear gloves or masks or anything of the sort. You're lucky if they wash their hands after they come out of the bathroom. Maybe they're starting to do that now because of the coronavirus, but every single restaurant you go to is so incredibly filthy, or it was before the coronavirus. This is actually the cleanest that the restaurants have ever been. We all remember the Chipotle Boston College E. coli scandal from a few years back. When I go out to eat, or when I was allowed to go out to eat before the Bill of Rights was trashed in the time of the pandemic, I never once ate food if I dropped it on the table, because I know that the rag that is used to clean the table has been sitting inside a bucket of sanitizer that has not been changed for 8 hours at best. The idea of food sanitation is a hilarious joke, and the faith that people put in those measures, it's so infantile and laughable and pathetic. And I actually wonder what several of my former coworkers are doing in the time of the pandemic. I just passed by earlier today the last restaurant I worked at. I was trapped there for 2.5 years before I decided to, do something else with my life. And I saw that I think there was only one car in the parking lot, and I'm pretty sure it was the managers. So those waiters and waitresses, and probably even most of the cooks, the hostesses, you name it, I don't know what they're doing in the time of the pandemic, but I can assure you that one $1,200 check is not even going to come close to cutting it. And these people, by the way, in the restaurant industry, they have serious substance abuse disorders. Many of them are convicted felons who struggle to get other jobs. I worked with, no. Most of the people who serve you food are convicted felons. I worked with many manslaughterers, attempted murderers, child rapists. I worked with all kinds of convicted felons in the restaurant industry. It attracts them because they can get hired on the spot. And I don't know what those people are doing right now. I would assume that their substance abuse has been ratcheted up to the highest degree that they can afford at this time. It's pretty pathetic and sad.
It's interesting who gets the what is it, essential worker designation, because I mean, I used to work as a courier, and delivery people are, of course, one of the most essential people on the planet right now. And I mean, they aren't making a lot of money. I made okay money when I was doing that job, but I worked for a small company. I mean, relatively small. I was active in 2 cities. And I mean, I do wonder what my former coworkers are dealing with right now. While the dispatchers would theoretically be able to work from home, obviously the delivery people can't. And it's very interesting, because obviously that would be the easiest way for a disease to spread, would be for delivery people going from place to place, handing over a thing, and you have to hand over a thing that you sign, and then, well, who's signing this? And you've got, it's really gross. So that this is really obviously not the key factor in deciding who's essential or not. But I wonder how many people are going to get turned into robots as far as their jobs. You're going to come back to work after being furloughed and find, whoops, what's this little robot doing my job?
What is that insurance company? Is it Farmers Mutual? The one that has the "We are farmers."
Farmers something. Yeah, farmers.
Yeah, I saw it today. I was on YouTube, and I saw that there was an ad for that company explaining that delivery drivers have been given expanded coverage or something like that in the time of coronavirus. Most delivery drivers, or at least a very large majority of them, do not have insurance because they cannot afford the premium that it places. As a former delivery driver, I understand, pizza delivery driver, I understand this all too well. Many of them are forced to lie and refuse to tell their insurance companies what they're doing, so that they don't have to pay out of pocket, because their rates will just skyrocket. So this idea that Farmers Mutual is giving expanded benefits to these drivers, that doesn't pertain to most of them. And in fact, most of them have been put out of work anyway because of this. The amount of demand for pizza delivery, I don't know that it's necessarily rising, because again, people cannot afford. That is seen as a luxury right now.
I thought pizza was like the cheap food that like people get when they can't
Yeah, but delivery, you have to pay the driver to come out to your house. You have to tip them. You're usually paying a delivery fee, even if you don't tip the driver, because the company has to pay for insurance that it is not extending to the driver. I don't know about some of the major corporations like Domino's and Pizza Hut. They may be a little bit different from the independent pizzerias. But then again, those independent pizzerias probably aren't going to survive. My favorite one right down the street was already forced to close on Sundays long before the coronavirus, and there was a Domino's that was scheduled to open up right across the street.
Getting back on topic, because pizza is not
really the most. I'm talking about the breakdown of the economy. I'm talking about how the eradication of small businesses and the rise of the corporations as a result of this. The idea that people are somehow surviving this, it's a cruel joke. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious, like, to what extent is some of this deliberate? Like, if this is a religious thing, like, we need sacrifice, right? So people are willingly. I think people are, one of the reasons why they're signing on to this religious thing, as far as obeying all the rules and everything, is because they want their sacrifice to be worth something. So you're sacrificing something for a war effort. I mean, you hear in England, there was rumors that, the power companies were mailing to customers and saying, well, the power might go out because, the virus. What does that have to do with electricity? The virus has nothing to do with electricity. It's ridiculous. But because, it's a war, and Bojo there, after I think this was before he got the virus. So, but he was talking about, this is a war effort. We need everybody to be on board and stiff up a lip and all of this, channeling Winston Churchill bullshit. And so, if we want our sacrifice, we can't go to work, and we are lining up for miles at food banks, and we're completely miserable, and we can't see our family and friends. But if our sacrifice is worth something. So I think that people genuinely want to believe, in some sense, maybe subconsciously, because I don't think that anybody actually thinking that out is going to go with it, because it's so absurd. But I do think that there is at least a subconscious degree of that, especially because they're getting the message hammered into their heads by Chris Cuomo and Anderson Cooper. And I mean, there's one particular video of Chris Cuomo that I think I've already used clips from it in 2 of my videos, just because it's so ridiculous, where he's talking about how, as a parent, I'm really concerned because, you're supposed to, these talking head types, now for the 5 people who still do watch CNN, they rely on these people for their certainty to get their news. They want those people to be really, really confident in what they're saying. So when somebody like that says, I'm not really sure that, I don't know what's coming next, and I'm really worried, and obviously that's going to scare them to death. So this is obviously being done for a reason. And so yeah, that's I definitely see there being a sacrifice element, or a desired sacrifice, or this will all be worth it at the end because we're going to come out of this. Well, you're going to come out of this tattooed with Bill Gates's vaccine barcode? I mean, I don't even want to go there, but
it goes back to the sense of narcissism that we mentioned earlier, the idea of being the chosen one in this kind of grand rapture, probably appealing to a lot of the individual efforts that are targeted in the global warming hysteria. People are told that they can single-handedly save the planet if they make sure to shut the faucet off while they're brushing their teeth. You've spoken and probably written about this before, how Greta Thunberg, she is lecturing people about their personal habits that are destructive to the environment, yet she has not said anything about our military actions, which of course are probably the single greatest contributor to global warming, certainly great in expending fossil fuels, or at least driving up the demand for fossil fuels. There's a parallel here with the coronavirus pandemic, where we want to think that if I do not go out to the grocery store today, and instead I just eat some of the furniture in my house, that is going to be the difference. I will save many, many lives. We talked earlier about the book of matches analogy. It's putting a great sense of importance and significance on individual people. And again, we're not saying that we should go about licking cartons of ice cream at the grocery store, or as that one NBA player did, tap microphones in order to demonstrate our imperviousness to the disease. But it is to call attention to the limited role that we all play, and more importantly, to raise questions about who exactly is promoting this message. The media decides which messages and topics reach a broad audience and which do not. That's why Joe Biden's rape accusation has not been gaining a whole lot of traction, and why Chris Hayes was demonized and crucified, again, to bring up religious imagery, when he dared to mention it last night. So there's definitely, the government here is very much adamant on trying to get people to buy into this message. But that brings up a serious issue that people have not talked about, which is the government, in conjunction with the media, has pushed mass hysteria over so many slighter illnesses over the years, like SARS and swine flu and avian flu, etc., that now, when we supposedly have one that we actually need to take seriously, people are so desensitized that they cannot respond to it properly. I mean, everyone wants to talk about the boy who cried wolf. They always use that to dismiss the person who's making some kind of radical claim. What people always forget is that at the end of the story, there actually was a wolf. And that's the point. And if that's the case here, if coronavirus is the wolf, the blame should not be directed towards the individual people who did not take the government's claim seriously. The blame should be directed towards the government and the media, who spun so many yarns over the years, deliberately so. They are the ones to blame for people not taking this seriously. It's not the people on the beach in Miami, it's the people in charge.
Yeah, and this is definitely where I was hoping to take it, as far as the second wave, or if not the second wave.
Yes.
If you know anything about what has happened with previous attempts to develop a vaccine for SARS, the animals, lab mice, was basically as far as they got, because once they inoculated the mice, and they challenged them with the virus, and the mice died a horrible death, basically bleeding out of all of their orifices, because it actually, the fact that you can't create a normal vaccine for this kind of virus. It just, for whatever reason, it actually makes the pathogen, or you get a similar sort of pathogenicity, but it's like twice as bad, or it's whatever it is, it's very bad, and they've found this out, multiple tests, and scientists were a little worried, because why are they diving straight into human testing with these people already being tested with these vaccines? And I'm very, very concerned about, if not a second wave of the usual sort, where, oh, let's let everybody out of confinement, where they've been having their immune system degraded for the last 3 months. If not that, then it's going to happen when they've managed to at least vaccinate a whole bunch of gullible people, and not even necessarily gullible, but hopeless people who are putting their faith, who are conned into putting their faith into Bill Gates and these pharmaceutical companies. That's I mean, just because our 1986, whatever the name of the act was, that indemnified pharmaceutical companies from the harms caused by their vaccinations. These drug companies are the same ones that have been fined billions and billions of dollars for killing people with their other drugs, things like Vioxx, Zyprexa, opioids, all these other drugs. And so you think that one category of drugs that they're indemnified against, that's the one that they're going to behave like angels in? I don't understand this, but this is of course how people think, because I mean the alternative is that, oh, big corporations are trying to kill you. Well, gosh, that's not fun. But if people are inoculated with this vaccination, and then the second wave comes along, or a new variety of coronavirus comes along, we're going to see some really bad shit happening. And that's going to be presented as, well, gosh, humanity, you deserved it. You didn't follow the rules closely enough. And then people are going to be doing the 21st century equivalent of self-flagellation, wearing hair shirts, and all of this up until then to prevent this from happening. Because on some level they're told, oh, the second wave comes around, it's going to be really bad. And then afterwards, those few who survive are going to be even more inclined to follow the rules. So it's just going to be, I mean, all of these ruling class mouthpieces, like Gideon Litchfield in the MIT Tech Review, talking about how, oh, we're going to have to do these rolling lockdowns all the time, because this is going to be a constant presence. And Bill Gates even talking about, until there's a vaccine, we're going to have to stay locked down, and otherwise we're all going to die. And it's like, well, damned if you do, damned if you don't, except not damned if you do, because maybe we should, go outside. But no, you can't say that. That's irresponsible. I said that in quotation marks, so don't take this video down. Anyway, anything you want to say towards the end? Because we're getting on an hour here.
Oh, we're more than that. We're getting close to 2 hours.
Yeah, I said getting on hours. I meant getting on an hours. I think I said hour.
The coronavirus has affected my hearing.
That's everything's a symptom. Everything's a symptom.
I wonder if the vaccine, I wonder if accepting the vaccine is the 21st century equivalent of shedding your foreskin. Well, the second wave, I remain relatively unperturbed by the biological threat posed by the coronavirus. My concern is with people's reaction to this, because, you know, it affects when you try to go out and get basic necessities, that you might be on a significant wait just because other people had to snatch up every single supply that they could find. And you can rest assured that people will engage in more of the panic buying this fall and winter, just because they anticipate another round of COVID-19. I guess it'll be COVID-20 at that point. That's what they're going to be anticipating. And so they're going to behave accordingly. And that's the issue, is it's the government's reaction here, not the disease itself, that has caused so much wanton damage. And so as for the second wave, yes, and the government has, I think that the government, much like Hitler has advised, has repeated the term and the supposed threat that it poses so frequently and relentlessly over the last several weeks, that now people have developed a kind of instinctive reaction to it, where if they hear the word, if they hear that there's possibly going to be a reprisal of the disease and the outbreak this Christmas season, they're going to immediately just go into a defensive mode in order to try to protect themselves against a perpetually undefined threat. So my final comment will be to bring it back to the religious leitmotif that you've been developing here. People who want to talk about putting human beings in the place of God, or trying to give them God-like reverence and authority and power, they ought to refer to the Old Testament, to the first book of Samuel, where the Hebrews come together and they decide that they want a king for the first time. And God tries to warn them that this is a terrible idea. If you take a human being, who of course man is fallible and weak and petty and easily tempted, if you put such a person in that kind of godly power and omnipotence, bad things are going to happen. But of course the Hebrews don't listen, and Samuel finds a man named, I believe it's Samuel, he finds a man named Saul, who becomes the first king. And what does Saul do? He is a terrible, lecherous, corrupt psychopath who tries to set up his adopted son David to be murdered by Goliath. that was my second favorite story of the Bible. My favorite story of the Bible was the story of the man whose wife was raped to death, and in order to, I don't know what he was doing in response, like, to grieve with this, but he decided to cut her up into 12 pieces and send by package the 12 pieces of her corpse to the various tribes of Israel. And as the narrator of the Bible says, an event like this was never heard again throughout all the days of Israel. And let us hope that we never hear another tale like COVID-19 in all the remaining days of the American empire. That will be my closing statement tonight.
Well, Bill Gates already has called it Pandemic 1. There's going to be a Pandemic 2 if he has anything to say about it. So I would say that, stop letting Bill Gates make policy. Trump has decided to defund the World Health Organization. That means the World Health Organization is now chiefly funded by Bill Gates. Maybe that wasn't such a great idea, Trump. All you Trump fanboys, can you please tell your president to, reverse that decision? Because that's crazy. He's now controlling world health policy completely. That's terrible. Anyway, so yeah, that's about it. I mean, I hope we've given you some food for thought. You can find Dack's work at overwritten.org. Mine, of course, at helenofdestroy.com. And yeah, I'll put up all of our information here on the last screen. Like, share, and subscribe, because your life might depend on it. Hey, you take the word of the media when they say that shit. Why not take our word for it? It's about as logical. Anyway, everybody have a good night or day or whatever it is.